So hello everybody and welcome to the next OpenUK Future Leaders Group training session. A little bit about the Future Leaders Group. We are a collection of individuals who are interested in open technology, including open source software, open hardware and open data. It includes a wide range of people that work in technology, intellectual property, outsourcing, procurement, data, coding and innovation, as well as private practice lawyers and in-house counsel that work in the technology sector and related fields. We operate under the direction of the OpenUK Legal and Policy Committee, and we have a clear purpose to bring together and develop future leaders in legal and policy matters relating to open technology, and to support and further the mission of the Legal and Policy Committee. The Future Leaders Group is currently co-chaired by me, Robert Gronells, I'm from Phil Fisher, and Katie Gibson from Bristows. We're both lawyers advising on technology and commercial matters. The group is always open to new ideas and to new members, whether getting involved in all of our activities or just tipping in and out of our various projects. And today I'm delighted to say we are joined by Dr. Sara Thomas from the Wikimedia Foundation, Wikimedia UK, and she is the Scotland Programme Coordinator there. And the topic of her talk today is Open Knowledge is Not Neutral. And without any further ado, over to you, Sara. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, Robert. And thank you very much to OpenUK for having me. I've just shared my screen there, so hopefully you should be able to see that first slide. Can I just check that that's the case?
Yep, all good.
Brilliant, fabulous. Okay, folks. So thanks everyone for coming. Thanks very much to OpenUK for having me. I was told the other day, a friend of mine who's a legal technologist, and he lectures a local university, and he'd been saying something that he's trying to make his presentations when they're online a little bit more engaging, and just trying to work with that a little bit. And he pulled out some interesting bits of research that said that when you do the orientation bit at the beginning of a chat, at the beginning of any sort of presentation about, where the toilets are and all this kind of stuff, that it just lets people relax and tune in to what it is that you're going to go and say. So let me say right at the beginning that I am expecting no Amazon deliveries. The toilets are probably exactly where you left them in your own bathroom. And if there is a fire or any sort of emergency, please do remember to panic. So I'm coming at you from the leafy west end of Glasgow. I have this new webcam set up, which I'm hoping is going to work. So I've got my computer over here and I have my camera over here. I'm hoping that's going to work. I'm so sick of sitting down to do presentations. So I'm going to try this and see how it works. So as I said, I'm Dr. Sara Thomas. I'm the Scotland Programme Coordinator for Wikimedia UK. My job is to advocate for the engagement with the Wikimedia projects across various different organisations. I help to support and develop partnerships with GLAM and education partners, and I also support the development of the volunteer community within Scotland. Before that, before I took this job on, I was a Wikimedian in residence at the Scottish Library and Information Council, and also Museums, Galleries, Scotland. Now, a Wikimedian in residence, you might not know what a Wikimedian in residence is, because quite frankly, not a lot of people do. A Wikimedian in residence is somebody that sits between an organisation and the great store of information that they have, and the incredible possibilities that are afforded by engagement with the Wikimedia project. So if you imagine a little Venn diagram, we kind of sit in the middle of that. We're sort of part Babelfish and part translator, part advocate, part trainer. The role that I do at Wikimedia UK is a part-time role. The rest of the time I also run a charity. I'm an events and volunteer manager, and I volunteer at a couple of organisations, including as a director of a community interest company that teaches and performs contemporary circus. So I have many, many hats. I've worked in the private sector, I've worked in the third sector. I have a strong preference for working in the third sector now after a few years working in live music. And as well as that, I still work in live music. I work in festivals, I work in events, I do some fundraising, I do digital training, and I'm occasionally a writer and a storyteller. So, as I said, quite a lot of hats. I'm kind of flicking just between sharing screen and just being me, but I'll see how this goes. So, the Wikimedia Foundation, just to give you a little bit of context, the Wikimedia Foundation is the overarching, the charity which stewards all of the Wikimedia projects. And by the Wikimedia projects, we mean Wikipedia, Wikimedia Commons, Wikidata, Wikisource, Wikiversity. There are many more. But the most well-known of those, obviously, is Wikipedia. Now, we have Wikimedia UK. Is the UK chapter of the Wikimedia movement of the community. So our main funder is the Wikimedia Foundation. And we work to various sets of strategic goals, of strategic principles. What I've got up on the screen now is the strategic direction, the current strategic direction for the Wikimedia Foundation. And it basically focuses on these two things: knowledge as a service and knowledge equity. Knowledge equity is the one that's going to be most relevant to what I'm going to talk about today. Knowledge equity, so this is what they have to say about knowledge equity. As a social movement, we will focus our efforts on the knowledge and communities that have been left out by structures of power and privilege. Focus our efforts on the knowledge and communities that have been left out by structures of power and privilege. We will welcome people from every background to build strong and diverse communities. We will break down the social, political and technical barriers preventing people from accessing and contributing to free knowledge. Wikimedia UK has 4 strategic objectives, which are as follows. So our strategic aims leading up to 2022 are to increase engagement with and representation of marginalised people and subjects, to work with partners to develop digital data and information literacy through Wikimedia, to create changes in policy and practice that enable open knowledge to flourish, and to develop our capacity and profile as a leading organisation for open knowledge. So all my work falls under one or more of these strategic goals. Today I'm probably focusing most on one and a little bit on 3, probably. Wikipedia's mission is to make the sum of all human knowledge, as I'm sure you're aware, I'm preaching to the converted here, to make the sum of all human knowledge available for free to every single person on the planet. Wikimedia Foundation and Wikimedia UK, these strategic objectives of ours are in part a response to the fact that we know that there are gaps in knowledge that is contained within the Wikimedia project. We've known this for a while. We've done a lot of research on it. There are various campaigns and pieces of work being done to address these knowledge gaps. We know, for example, that most of the editors on English Wikipedia are men. We also know that only around 18% of the biographies on English Wikipedia are not about men, for example. This gender gap is probably the knowledge gap that I know most about in terms of Wikimedia, but it's far from the extent of the knowledge gap. We know that we are missing, for example, a great deal of knowledge and a great deal of voices that come from the global south. So I'm talking from a couple of starting points today. There are a couple of underlying assumptions that are going to go into this presentation. I've entitled this "Knowledge is not neutral." Very specifically, open knowledge is not neutral. I passionately believe in the power of open knowledge for good. I think that a general public that has access to good quality, reliable information is a general public which can be more informed and which therefore can make better decisions. And we keep getting asked to make really big decisions based on incomplete and inaccurate information, and that is not good enough. It does not lead us to a better society. This will come as no shock to anyone. But I work for Wikimedia UK. I mean, this should be pretty obvious that I do believe in the power of open knowledge. But what I don't think that means, it doesn't mean that we are exempt from the critique, or that we shouldn't reflect on our own practice. There are 3 foundational points then that underlie what I'm going to talk about today. The first of these is technology is not neutral. The second, that not everything about open is free. And the third, that the historical record is a rigged game. So the first of these then, technology is not neutral. What do I mean by that? Really what I want to pin that down to is both that technology can be used against us and that technology does not filter out our own biases. There's a really great talk. If this is something that people are less familiar with, or this whole concept, or this whole kind of political idea is that if anyone is less familiar with it, there's a really good talk available online. I'll chuck the link into the slides later on to send them out, by a guy called Billy Mikey, who's a researcher working in Hawaii, who's really good on the politics of technology, particularly on social media. and surveillance, and the idea that we shouldn't be walking blindfold into giving up our own data. So I've nicked this "technology is not neutral" from a presentation that he gave in 2019. It's definitely worth a watch. It's about 10-15 minutes long. One of the other things that Billy Mikey is quite good at doing is about encouraging people to be reflective on their own practice, to question open, and to critique what it is that we are doing ourselves. Technology is not neutral. Design is a really good example of this. I mean, this is hardly a new concept. This has been around for a while, but there's been some really interesting examples recently. Female crash test dummies, for example, weren't used in the US until I think it was 2011. There was a really good example, a video that kind of did the rounds in 2017. I saw it on Gizmodo. I can't remember where it was originally shown, but I saw it on Gizmodo, of a video of two guys in a bathroom who are trying to use this automated soap dispenser. There's a white guy and a black guy, and the white guy sticks his hand underneath the soap dispenser, and it's got a little sensor on it, and it dispenses soap, and everything's fine. And then the black guy tries to do it, and it doesn't work. And the audio in the back of the video is the guy saying, "Yeah, I'm too black for this." And I kind of did this from wondering, like, okay, so there's something gone wrong in the design process there. There's something where you've only tested that with people with white skin and not people with black skin. And I kind of got to wondering how the hell it is that we live in a world where soap dispensers can become racist. And sure, it's an oversight, and it can be explained away as a harmless mistake because the soap dispenser is not intentionally being racist. But its appearance in this public bathroom is indicative of a system which, to put it kindly, has a blind spot when it comes to race. And this blind spot is the symptom, perhaps, of a social system in which white bodies have been given priority and supremacy over black bodies. And we see this elsewhere too. So there are a number of examples. What was the AI? I forget the thing. The bot, I think maybe it was Google that released it. And within like 4 hours of it being released into the public, it had turned into a bigot and was spouting all of this racist stuff. There's any number of stories like this. There's a good book by Sophia Omojinobo called Algorithms of Oppression, which looks at how search engines reinforce racism and casts probably a much needed eye, critical and analytical light on what should be a pretty basic concept to us all, that if you put rubbish in, you're going to get rubbish out. And you can look at it as a systems problem, sure, that we need to design a better system, but you can't do that unless you look at the contexts in which that system is produced. Our technology is imbued with our own biases. Our algorithms and our search engines can prove this. Social media, far from being the utopia of free expression that I definitely once very idealistically thought it was going to be, has and is used to manipulate societies, to create echo chambers, and to sell things that we don't need to people who can't afford it, and also to sell the knowledge and the capital of our interactions within those networks to people who will use that against us. Technology is not neutral. Moving on to the second of these, this idea that nothing about open is free. Again, I think I'm probably preaching to the converted a little bit on this, but there are a couple of points that I want to draw out of some of the work that I've been doing and some of the things that underlie what I'm going to talk about when I talk about Wiki. The price of open access may, of course, be nothing, but that doesn't mean that it's free. Lorna Campbell of the OER service at the University of Edinburgh, and who is also a trustee of Wikimedia UK, has recently talked about the relationship between open practice, particularly within an education context, and invisible digital labour. So this is a quote from a blog post from FemEdTech. So Catherine Cronin has eloquently reminded us that openness is a continually negotiated space, a constantly negotiated practice. We all experience openness differently from different perspectives and different positions of privilege and discrimination. For some of us, open education is part of our job. For some, it's research, our field of study. For some, it's philosophy and ethos, a personal commitment. For some, it's political. For many, it's all of the above. This blog post then fed into a conference presentation that Lorna gave earlier this year, and there are 3 questions that I have tried to take on board and try to influence my own practice. And these are those. How much does the open community rely on invisible digital labour? How far does it exclude those who are unable or unwilling to contribute their labour for free? And crucially, how do we mitigate this? So let me reflect on my own practice and my own situation to illustrate what it is that I mean by this. I'm a university-educated, middle-class, white cis woman with a permanent contract who owns her own home, is child-free and has no caring responsibilities. I lay all of these things out right at the outset because I want to be quite explicit about the fact that my own contribution to open knowledge and to the community, and to the Scottish community in particular, is one which I make from a position of privilege. I'm afforded a number of things by this position, one of which is a relative amount of certainty about things like the roof that is currently over my head and where my next meal is coming from. And that links to the second point, because the thing that it affords me is time. My secure employment status, which I'm incredibly lucky to have, especially in the current situation, and I am very cognizant of that, grants me the time to volunteer my labour for other causes. My relationship with Open is curious because I get paid to contribute. So this presentation that I'm giving today is within the scope of my role at Wikimedia UK. But to make the wider point, I volunteer in senior roles at 3 separate charities, community organisations, and that's a privilege that I get from security and economic status. My voice is heard. I am in a position to be able to contribute and to be heard. Wikipedia is not the only open project which benefits from the digital labour of volunteers. The community is the biggest strength of Wikipedia. And Wikipedians intensely dislike paid editing for good reason, because paid editing, in our experience, tends to lead to unfairness and a lack of neutrality. It undermines the integrity of the encyclopedia. Wikipedia is, as I think Wired put it recently, the last best place on the internet, and part of that is because Wikipedia is a labour of love. But what if you cannot afford the time to edit Wikipedia? What happens to your voice then? We accept, I hope we have come to accept, that business that was only ever done on the golf course excluded those who were not able to access the golf course, and the society in which that golf course and everything that comes with that kind of work, the context in which that sits. So similarly, how many hackathons provide childcare? I think it's interesting that I find it unusual that Art and Feminism are an intersectional, describe themselves as an intersectional feminist non-profit organisation that looks to directly address the challenge, the knowledge gap on the internet, and specifically on Wikipedia. And specifically during their campaign period, which is around International Women's Day, they will give grants for childcare for events that have been running under that banner. And that is very unusual. So to go back to Lorna's question, what voices are excluded from our open practice because they are not in a position to volunteer time? And to link back to the Wikimedia Foundation's strategic direction, which voices are being left out by those structures of power and privilege? And what are we going to do about it? Moving on to my third point, that the historical record is a rigged game. In 2016, Alistair G. Tuff published an article in the Journal of Archives and the Journal of the Archives and Records Association, entitled "Thinking About and Working with Archives and Records: A Personal Reflection on Theory and Practice." It's a reflection on archives and records theory based on his 40 years of experience within the industry, and he opens the paper with this. The author began work in 1975. A senior colleague gave him 2 memorable pieces of advice during his first week in the archives profession. Firstly, he was told never to waste time on women's papers. Secondly, he was urged to make sure that anything he earmarked for disposal was actually destroyed and that no evidence of the matter was kept, lest historians should make a fuss about it later. Clearly, conventional thinking about archives and records has moved on significantly over the past 40 years. Now, certainly the archivists that I know are pretty horrified by the idea and do seem to have the general acceptance that even if you don't like it, you keep it, you must contextualise this. But that's interesting. I mentioned earlier that only 18% of the biographies on English Wikipedia were about women, or more accurately, were not about men. The exact current figure, as of July 2020, is 18.53%. Now, back in October of 2014, that figure was just 15.5%, 15.53%. So in 6 years, we've moved that bar 3%. And that is a tiny amount, but it represents a huge amount of work, concerted effort on the part of the community, on the part of the foundation, on the part of other organisations and affiliates like ourselves to right that balance. There is, in fact, a wiki project that leads on this. They're called Wiki Project Women in Red, and they're all about turning red links on Wikipedia, so ones that don't exist, where don't have articles, into blue links to where they do have articles. Part of the issue, part of the reason that we have this disparity, and it's not the only reason, there are many reasons for this, but part of the issue that we have is because the sources for men's history are much easier to come by than the sources for women's history. And indeed, sorry, my original line is the sources for men's here are easier to come by than those for the history of other genders. Not just because, as we've seen here in Alice's quote, that those records might have actually been destroyed, but because of the way in which that history which survives has been written in a manner which such as to deprioritise the achievements of women. And that becomes a feedback loop in terms of study, in terms of research, and ultimately in terms of public consciousness. The game is rigged. So then to move to Wikipedia. I'm going to mostly talk about Wikipedia and a little bit about Wikidata, but mostly about Wikipedia. Wiki has no adverts. It's this, as we're calling it, this last best place on the internet, and it is where people come for reliable information. We know that Wikipedia is the first place where people go when they get a diagnosis of something. We know that there is a huge interdependent relationship between Wiki and Google. If you're Googling anything, you're going to have something from Wikipedia on the front page. That's on the first page of results. That's just the way it's going to be. And that has problems when it comes to the feedback loop of things disappearing, of hidden histories disappearing into the ether. To kind of illustrate this point, these are a couple of screen grabs that I took of what happened to page views for things to do with coronavirus in February, through the beginning of February to the end of March of this year. So this is, you can get to this from the back end just by a couple of clicks on any Wikipedia page. This isn't any kind of special knowledge. Page views for the kind of, what's that, about 90 days, 60 days, sorry. For the coronavirus, the page that's just about coronavirus, daily average of over 250,000 people. For coronavirus disease 2019, as that's a separate article, during the same time period, we have a daily average of 127,530 people. When you come to the one about the article about the 2019 to 2020 coronavirus pandemic, then you're looking at a daily average of 289,888, but a median within that period, as you can see, because it doesn't appear until right at the end of that period. That's a new article, and it's getting a median of 1.1 million people per day. So the TLDR on this is that people are in search of information, and we have a responsibility to ensure that they can get it and they can get it accurately. We have a responsibility to ensure that the information that is presented there is accurate and it is reliable. So when we move on to this, the only way that we can maintain this, the only way that we can ensure that we have an encyclopedia whose integrity has been presented, is to has some very basic rules, has some very basic tenets. And we usually call these the 5 pillars of Wikipedia. And there are some key guidelines, key rules that underpin any contributions to Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is the encyclopedia that anyone can edit, but just because you can edit it doesn't mean that you can say just anything. And there are 2 things that I'm gonna pick up on here to illustrate what it is that I've been talking about. Technology is not neutral, and open is not free, and the historical game is right. The first of these is neutral point of view. So neutral point of view is one of the kind of guiding principles of Wiki. I'm looking at the version that is on English Wikipedia, just for clarity. A neutral point of view means representing fairly, proportionately, and as far as possible without editorial bias, that all significant views that have been published by reliable sources on a topic. So so far so good. So please present just the facts as far as possible. Okay, fair enough. I'd mentioned that I'd taken this from English Wikipedia. And this isn't because neutral point of view is something which is specific to English Wikipedia. I just wanted to point out that Wikipedia has, I think it's 302 languages, language versions, of which 298 are active. They are all different communities. Articles are not necessarily a carbon copy in one language of what they are in another language. So what do different Wikipedias say about different subjects? Let me take, as an example, the Vietnam War. If you look at the Vietnam War article in English and the Vietnam War or the American War, resistance against the US, in Vietnamese wiki, they say similar things, they are based on similar facts, but they present very different viewpoints, as you would probably expect. They're both pretty decent articles. They describe the same events. They're both semi-protected, which is interesting because they can be fairly contentious. So you can't edit that unless you're a more experienced editor. But they are not the same article. If you look at the Vietnamese one, and I don't speak Vietnamese, so I was looking at it in Google Translate, which does an okay job, but not great. If you look at the Vietnamese one, the anti-communist policy of the US is given significantly more primacy in the Vietnamese article than it is in the English article. Neutral point of view is something that we strive towards, but it's important to acknowledge, I think, that it is an active work in progress. It's also important to acknowledge that neutral point of view is not the same thing as objectivity. There is no such thing, I don't really think, as true objectivity, although I suppose in some religions you might argue that God, or the existence of God, or God's viewpoint might represent true objectivity, but I'm pretty sure that the existence and viewpoint of God is out with the scope of a 45-minute chat on a Friday afternoon, so put that one aside. Neutral point of view is this central tenet of Wikipedia. And there have been a lot of pixels spilled on non-political action, on that Wikipedia should be apolitical, that Wikipedia should not be a place for agendas or soapboxes, and that's right. But it's not the whole story. Neutral point of view is absolutely critical in reaching consensus. So Wikipedia as a community, it's based on consensus. You tend to find, there have been various pieces of research done, that you will go into a Wikipedia article and it may tend to veer off to the left politically, and then it'll veer off to the right politically, and then it'll kind of settle down somewhere in the middle. There's a really good quote from Catherine Mayer, who's the CEO of the Wikimedia Foundation, Chief Operating Officer of the Wikimedia Foundation. And she says that Wikipedia is the one place on the internet where you go for an argument and become more reasonable over time. And that's because of consensus. That's because of the way that this works. But open practice is not non-political. It can't be. Open practice to me is intrinsically linked to ideas of social justice. It's been well documented how some countries have banned or have sought to ban Wikipedia, including Turkey, China and Russia. And in this way, we must understand that providing free access to information is a political and sometimes a radical political act. Neutral point of view can be difficult for a couple of reasons, primarily because, as I've said, that nothing can ever be truly neutral, but also because it can tie people up in this obfuscation of privilege and the occasional mischaracterization as the endeavour to plug particular gaps in knowledge as a soapbox or an agenda. And this is unfortunately where we start to see the perpetuation of off-wiki biases creeping into wiki. It is not impossible to weaponize neutrality in order to silence particular voices, and particularly those voices which have been left out by structures of power and privilege. So now I'm going to talk about one of the second important things that underlies Wikipedia, and that is notability. Notability is an interesting one. The notability guideline on Wikipedia says this, and again, this is from English Wikipedia. English information on Wikipedia must be verifiable. If no reliable independent sources can be found on a topic, then it should not have a separate article. Wikipedia concept of notability applies this basic standard to avoid indiscriminate inclusion of topics. Article and list topics must be notable or worthy of notice. So on Wikipedia, notability is used as a test by editors to decide whether or not a given topic warrants its own article. It must be verifiable. We have a general notability guideline. So your general notability guideline says that if a topic has received significant coverage in reliable sources that are independent of the subject, it's presumed to be suitable for a standalone article or list. And there's a couple of things that I'll pull out of that. Significant coverage means something that has been addressed in detail. So if you're looking to establish notability of a band, you're not going to include listings in a local magazine in the list, something like that. Reliable means that they need editorial integrity. Now again, this is really useful because it helps us to exclude things like tabloid newspapers that have a really bad reputation for fact-checking and accuracy, and it allows us to really to put the emphasis on things like university textbooks or peer-reviewed journals, and that's really important. Peer-reviewed journals is incredibly important. Again, to come back to some of the coronavirus stuff, it's really important that we represent the consensus, that we represent what is known and what can be thought to be reliable. But it does mean that if your subject has not been covered by that area of a peer-reviewed journal, if your subject is something which lies out with the canon and something which has been excluded by those same structures of power and privilege, it's going to be more difficult to find those sources. And this is where we end up with a lot of pixels being spilled within Wikipedia sometimes, because some say that Wikipedia shouldn't be, it's not it's a hammer to crack a nut. But Wikipedia does have a role to play in ensuring, because of the ubiquity and the power of the site, in ensuring that those voices which have been excluded don't continue to be excluded. Ostensibly, and to be fair, the Notability Guideline is in place to defend the integrity of the encyclopedia, to stop it being abused. But as I've said, notability depends on the existence of secondary sources. And as we have established, the ways in which knowledge is produced is not neutral, and it is an effect of privilege to believe that it is. If the historical record is a rigged game, the search for sources upon which to determine notability and therefore allow entry to the encyclopedia is ultimately stymied. And there are a number of things that we can do about this, and there are a number of things that Wikimedia communities do about this. We encourage people to write papers. We encourage, say, universities to write blogs about interesting things that they find that will help us plug knowledge gaps because they're a reliable source. We want to feed into that loop where we know that there are more sources, where we can create more sources so that we can then be used on Wikipedia. And that's a really long way around for a shortcut. There are other things that we can do. We can use Wikidata, where the Notability Guideline is different. We can use Wikidata to create a record, an item for, say, someone whose work has been forgotten, a woman whose work has been forgotten. And from that, we can do things like create red list links of articles. We can start to examine the gap in knowledge that we have. We can get involved in the process of the internal processes of Wikipedia, where articles are maybe going to be nominated for deletion, and we can get involved in those spaces. There are practical things that we can do about this, but ultimately this is a problem which exists off Wikipedia as well as in Wikipedia. Wikidata is an interesting one in this respect, because, as we've seen, it maybe has slightly fewer of those biases. I'm going to leave that on the notability slide for now. If you haven't come across Wikidata, I suspect that many people on this call will have done, but if you haven't, it is the repository of structured data which underpins all of the Wikimedia projects. And on the face of it, facts are going to be more neutral. We're looking at names and dates. And the Notability Guidelines, as I said, are very different. But let's remember that our tech is not neutral, and that open is not neutral. And that anyone who's worked in structured data, anyone who's worked in the ontology of data knows that it's absolutely not as simple as that. And it's not as simple as that because it reflects and it's influenced by the assumptions of the people who designed that structure for the data. So again, if you put rubbish in, you're going to get rubbish out. And these things are not neutral. I was having a conversation with some colleagues just recently. I've been trying to run a search on Wikidata for museums that are based in Scotland. And I know that this used to work because I went in and did all of the work to add in country, as P17 country, Scotland. And I ran it the other day because I was wanting to check something, was wanting to do a bit of work, and I found that it returned me 0 museums. It returned me no museums whatsoever, which I thought was a bit odd, because I'm relatively sure that there are a few museums in Scotland. But it returned nothing. And I went back and looked in some of the records and realised that intersection was no longer there. So it no longer said country Scotland. It was either returning country as United Kingdom, or it was returning actually what's a much more granular piece of information about the local administrative territory. And as I went through different records, I found that this had been done for a lot of them, and in fact that there is a bit of a discussion going on about whether or not we use country, whether or not that's actually a useful way to describe things, or whether we should look at administrative territories. That's a really complicated discussion, because if I want to run a search for museums in Scotland, I don't want to have to run a search for everything that is within 32 local authority areas. And then what happens if the local authority area changes, which it is likely to do at some point? There are issues to do with the historicity. And we'll not get into many arguments that were had on various different Wikimedia projects between Scotland and UK, and the same thing happens for Wales and UK. If Catalonia and Spain, you can imagine that these sorts of things are not isolated. How do we recognise a country? There was also a conversation recently with colleagues where we were looking for we were talking about the ethics of representation of slave ownership and enslaved within the database. And it came up because we were looking at, one of our colleagues they were looking at, do you put this down as an occupation? Do you put this down as a social class? Because property owner, as distasteful as that is related to social class at the time. And it is not only a minefield, but fascinating and disturbing and distasteful, but absolutely shows us that these things are not neutral. How do we address the historicity of this? How do we address the assumptions and the biases and the all of the context that goes within that? We may strive for neutral point of view, but we can't be truly objective. And the way that knowledge is produced is not neutral. What we have instead is consensus. Consensus is the basis upon which many of the Wikimedia projects work, and particularly on Wikipedia. So consensus is accepted as the best method with which to achieve Wikipedia's goals, i.e. the 5 pillars. Consensus on Wikipedia does not mean unanimity. I'm stumbling over words today, which is ideal or achievable, nor is it the result of a vote. Decision-making and reaching consensus involve an effort to incorporate all editors' legitimate concerns while respecting Wikipedia's policies and guidelines. Consensus is messy. Any decision by committee, is messy. And it is difficult, and it takes a long time. Consensus is not agile by any means, but it is also the great strength of Wikipedia, because it means that these discussions are had in the open, literally in the open on talk pages. And that is the great strength, and that is one of the reasons that I know that this work is worth doing. The spaces, however, in which consensus is reached are also negotiated spaces. And we have to look at who controls those and how they are managed. And if those spaces are subject to the same issues that we've raised here, of voices being left out, of structures of power and privilege, the re-entrenchment of biases and inequity, we find ourselves enmeshed within issues of gatekeeping. Community consensus is not immune to the issues that I've laid out here. It is far from perfect, but it is the best we've got. And in the context of fake news, as sick of I am of talking about that, and post-truth, as sick of I am of talking about that too, it's a methodology that I believe is worth the work. And I want to give you some examples of why. This is a piece from Wired from 15th of March, about how Wikipedia was preventing the spread of coronavirus misinformation. And I'm like, cool, okay, thanks very much, Wyatt. I mean, medical articles on Wiki, as I think I might have said earlier, have the highest standards of proof for anywhere within the encyclopedia. It's really difficult to get outlier information or, outlier research studies, misleading information. It's got to be literature reviews of literature reviews. We know that people go onto Wiki when they get a diagnosis, and that's, if the information there is wrong, that has a seriously negative effect on their mental health. So it's really difficult to vandalize those areas of the encyclopedia. And that's fine, that's why that's, I kind of would expect. Great, we're kind of turning the tide from coming back from being thought of as being unreliable. But this happened too. And this is from the Telegraph. This is not exactly what I would have thought would be the most wiki-friendly of publications. And this was there. Why Wikipedia is winning against the coronavirus infodemic. Against all odds, Wikipedia's eccentric volunteer editors are holding back the tide of coronavirus misinformation. There is a weird propaganda. I think it's probably a cover for some alt-right, scary alt-right folk. And one of my friends had come across this and said, you work in information literacy, can you have a look at this and tell me what you think of it? And most of it's in German, so I stuck Google Translate on it again, but some of it's in English. And I came across a page that was almost entirely about how they thought that Wikipedia was unreliable. And I thought, this is really unusual. Okay. And then found their German Wikipedia article and Google translated the talk page of that, which is very, very critical of them, and suddenly things started to make more sense. Wikipedia is a place that's for all its faults and for all that we are not perfect, where we are trying to be reflective about our own practice, that we can come out with something good. This was one of the more recent pieces that I've been reading from Slate about how Wikipedia became a battleground for racial justice. I'll not, looking at the time, I'll not recap this in great detail, but we were looking, as a contributor, rethinking what Wikipedia's commitment to neutrality actually means. And there is some excellent discussion there and some very thought-provoking things around how we look at different voices, how we represent particular incidents. Do you call it killing or do you call it murder when you talk about George Floyd? These sorts of things are conversations that are really worth having and that they're important that we have. So, yeah, it is a methodology that I believe is worth the work, as long as we can be critical, as long as we can critique ourselves, as long as we can be open about the issues that we have with open. Open knowledge is not neutral, but it can be more representative and it can be more fair. That's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was absolutely fascinating. Does anyone have any questions? I've got one if no one else does. No. I was just wondering whether you think museums do actually have a part to play here, and whether, obviously, they themselves aren't neutral, but in terms of reaching consensus and their contributions and starting a dialogue kind of on a global scale, whether is that happening? Would that happen? Do you see a role for that?
Absolutely. I think the debate within, so I work with Museums Galleries Scotland, with a development agency for the sector within Scotland. So I got to talk to, I was a really privileged position to be able to talk to a lot of different people in a lot of different museums and get this kind of crash course in what was happening within the sector. And I was fascinated to talk to people who were working specifically in the area of decolonisation and in the area of repatriation of items and this kind of thing. And the work that we do with GLAMS, galleries, libraries, archives and museums is partly about, hey, we'd really like to get some openly licensed pictures. But we're also talking about trying to harness their expertise on this. And in terms of reaching consensus, I think it's really important. I mean, I quite often on this, I want everyone to edit Wikipedia. I want more diverse voices on Wikipedia. It won't get, you can't get the whole sum of human knowledge onto Wiki if you only have a very tiny demographic doing that. But yes, I think there is a role for museums to play in contributing to those debates and in publishing and in making that information open and openly available. Yeah, I think I've answered what you said. I'm not sure.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, it's really interesting. I think we've got a couple questions. Amanda, I think you were first. There you are.
Hello. How are you doing, Sarah?
Yeah, not
Great
bad.
talk.
Yourself?
Yeah, really good talk. Really interesting. And I've heard some of what you said before when I first heard you speak in Edinburgh, maybe about a year ago,
Oh
9
wow,
months ago.
yeah.
Yeah, and it feels like a lifetime now, obviously. What's really interesting to me is that when you talk about this position of privilege and our ability to contribute in increasing diversity, it's obviously something that we work on all the time, and it's free for anyone to participate in what we do, as it is with, Wikimedia. But you're right, it is a luxury of time. So lockdown has been great because we haven't been able to do other things, so we all have more time to contribute. So it's good for the not-for-profit sector and NGOs and organisations like ours. But I am a great example. I get paid part-time, and I'm sure that everybody I work with here realises that I work full-time or more for OpenUK. And it's a really difficult thing because you have this transition point where you can build something wonderful, but then you need to be able, for its longevity, to find the funding to pay for its own excellence. And it's that, how do you find the funding to pay for its own excellence to make it diverse and inclusive? That's a really difficult question.
Yeah, it's a huge tension.
Tipping point, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Any recommendations for us?
Oh God, keep looking. Keep on going. I think, yeah, it's so I work as a volunteer manager sometimes for events and music festivals. And they need to pay me to help with volunteers, and there's various chats about what's the ethics of this and how can people how is it fair for people to devote their time, and we've done a lot of work on that actually. Volunteering in general, in-person volunteering as well as digital volunteering, needs to do the work on what is a fair exchange. Volunteering is a very can be a privilege if you have the time, as we've said. And I think it needs to be worked on. What is that fair exchange? What is it fair to ask for? What do people get out of it? Actually, a lot of my work as a volunteer manager has been about ensuring that volunteers get the best experience they possibly can do from that experience. That you're not just using them as cheap labour, they're getting something out of it as well. So that's, I think the answer, I don't know what the answer is, but I think the answer lies in this politics of exchange. And what people get actually. Yeah. So things like, for example, in music festivals, I always make sure that you don't, if you however many shifts you do for free, that you do for free so that you get your ticket to the festival, it's always balanced against how much the ticket costs. And what that works down as in terms of either minimum wage or living wage, depending on how rich the festival is, and how much they do. Always aim for living wage if you can, and that's how many hours you do. And you say, well, that's the fair exchange then. That's how it works. But I think there is something in that, in the politics of exchange, and how we can make volunteering the most valuable experience it can be, and also to pay for services where services need to be paid for.
It's really interesting. So yes, I agree. Pay where you can and for what you need to, and find the money to do that. But that balance of the barter, so making sure that people get what they want, but also I suppose it's very difficult to manage volunteers, and we've got loads of them, and we have to manage a high level of delivery and a high standard, or there's no point in doing it. You're better to have fewer people doing less than to have bad product, which you guys, your quality control must be among the best. And it's really interesting, but also I suppose there's a risk of volunteers with the wrong intent, but then you want everyone to be able to contribute, so it's a really difficult balance. No, really interesting. Thank you.
Quite all right.
No, you're going to say more?
Oh,
We had another question from Terence. Do you want to ask it, or do you want me to go for it?
I can ask it.
Okay.
It's working. I was just wondering, so obviously you've been doing sort of Wikipedian in residence stuff with the GLAM sector, but what about should the NHS or government departments be editing Wikipedia directly, assuming they can avoid conflict of interests?
Yeah, yeah. So conflict of interest is the big one on that. And for those of you who may never have come across this, there is a Twitter account. I haven't checked it in a little while. I'm not sure if it's still active. That tracks all edits made, all anonymous edits made to Wikipedia from the IP range of the Houses of Parliament. And there's also one that tracks Whitehall, which makes for fascinating reading sometimes. It went offline for a little while. It might be back. It was like Parliament edits and Whitehall edits. So conflict of interest is usually the thing that gets brought up because there are some circumstances in which PR agencies, for example, or celebrities, people in the public eye, might not want things to be on Wikipedia. So the most common form of that interaction, unfortunately, sometimes can be that people kind of wiki-washing biography or changing certain things. And there can be a bit of resistance from within the community about people doing this kind of editing directly. Because some people get into this mentality of people are trying to harm the integrity of the encyclopedia. But yes, there definitely is a role for those organisations and for those institutions to contribute towards open knowledge. So I did some work with the Scottish Government Library when we were talking about some of their publications which are released on an open government licence, and how those could be released and how those could be used for kind of third-party links, and how they could be used within Wikipedia to contribute, to make a positive contribution to the encyclopedia. We've talked a little bit to NHS libraries as well. My colleague Delphine Dallison, who was the Wikimedian in residence at the Scottish Library and Information Council after me, she did some work specifically with NHS libraries and around health information, and it's quite an interesting and sometimes difficult area to manage, but there are totally ways to do it. I do think, especially when it comes to new pieces of research or a kind of public health. I've done public health editathons before. That's been really interesting, because you have people who are experts in subjects which are out with sort of medical info, but within public health where if you are trying to reach a great audience, a bigger audience, in a place where people are going to look, actually getting information onto Wiki can be really, really valuable. Input in kind of external links as well, and there's particular kind of technical ways to do it. We try to avoid people like link spamming all the time, but certainly I think if people have good quality stuff, there's definitely a role for that to be in Wiki, and where it is making a good quality contribution to the encyclopedia.
That's great. Thank you very much.
See you.
Anyone? Any other questions? We've got a few more minutes left. No? Well, thank you so much for your time, Sarah. That was absolutely fascinating and such a great way to end our spring and summer series of OpenUK Future Leaders Group talks. So we'll be back in September picking up on commercial models. But thank you so much again, Sarah. That was great. And hopefully see everyone again in September.
Lovely to be here. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks, Sarah.
Bye.
Bye.